Psycho 2. This movie's really important to me, and you could chalk that up to nostalgia. I'm going to give you a brief story about how I came into contact with this movie initially, but before I do that, I think it's just important for me to really get something out of the way, which is that I shouldn't look back this fondly on this movie. I mean, it's a sequel to Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is one of the most important horror films ever made. I mean, this is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho we're talking about. There's no way a sequel can live up to the original. I mean, right? Clearly it's nostalgia glasses working their magic, right? Because Psycho. But no, every rewatch of Psycho 2 has borne out that this is the rare sequel that enhances the original. And while I'm not going to say it's a better film than Psycho, Psycho 2 was in a unique position of that was never going to happen. Psycho is just the stone-cold film classic that you measure every other film classic against if you're into darker cinema. So, what is Psycho 2? Is it a cash grab meant to cash in on the burgeoning slasher subgenre during a time when, I mean, it must have been obvious that if you owned the rights to the granddaddy of that whole movement, you had to cash in, right? Well, it is that thing. But I think everyone involved understood it couldn't be just that thing. In fact, when you look at the film that they made a film that had a lot of reverence for Hitchcock, but weren't exactly trying to ape Hitchcock. There was an understanding that what he accomplished, they couldn't. So what they could do to honor him is make the best film that they could. Of course, borrowing some of the iconic visuals of the original, but never cloyingly. Never the way today in cinema you constantly get, hey, do you remember that thing? I'm going to just put it up on screen to remind you that you know that thing and you like that thing, so you must love this film too, right? That's not what Psycho 2 does at all. And the brilliance of Psycho 2 is in recontextualizing all that iconic imagery. It makes the original film all that much more powerful. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to my childhood. As a young horror fan, I was sat in front of a television screen and by my mother and told to watch this. I think you'll like it. And she walked away. The movie that was playing on television was Psycho. And I was transfixed and terrified and elated, and I knew that I'd just encountered something that had changed my life and the direction of my life. I understood that, even at that age. But I didn't know what I'd experienced, really. Psycho is a dense film, even though it's a simple story. There's so much more going on than just narrative or plot or story or character or dynamicism. It's something magical. It's lightning in a bottle. It is every film frame perfectly composed like a painting. There's very few films that can capture that sort of magic, and Psycho does all those things. And it also scares the hell out of children and adults. So I knew I was on the hook. I knew that I'd not stop chasing the high that I got from watching Psycho alone. So Psycho 2 comes out. It's been 22 years since the original, which at that time felt like a million years away. But today, 22 years seems like nothing. Like, there's films that are 22 years old now that feel like they just came out, and I can remember every moment of going to the theater to see them. But back in the early 80s, a film that came out in the 60s seemed, well, as far away as ancient Egypt to me. Psycho 2 was coming out. There was an excitement about that movie. In the mainstream, there was a lot of interest. No one really knew the backstory, how it was originally designed to go to television, and then it ended up going to theaters because Anthony Perkins signed on, and no one knew that backstory at that time. But what we did know is we were getting a sequel to Psycho, and that was unthinkable. Sequels were rare enough. It's not today everything's a sequel or part of a franchise or a shared universe, but back then, sequels were a rare breed. And the idea of a sequel that was so belated That was just not on anyone's dance card. So there was a lot of interest in this one. And Psycho was kind of sacred ground for my family, certainly for me. So only twice in my youth did my entire family go to the movies. I saw a lot of movies in the theater, but that was with my grandmother. But there was 2 times, Psycho 2 and Jaws 3. I don't need to tell you which is a better film experience and a better film, period. But we went to go see Psycho 2 with the understanding that none of us thought it would be as good as the original. And I remember even back then walking out, everyone going, well, damn, that was kind of great. That kind of moved us in ways we didn't expect to be moved. And it wasn't the movie we expected. And that's the important part of what makes Psycho 2 so damn good. Psycho 2 tells a story that's perfectly aligned with the original, as any good sequel should, but from a completely 360 viewpoint. Here, we're on the side of Norman Bates. We see him recovered, spent his time, did his time, seems to really repent. In a religious sense, he's found some kind of salvation. Although he's still haunted by what happens, he's haunted in a very healthy way at first, in that he understands the gravity of what happened. And he doesn't want to be that monster. Desperately doesn't want to be that monster, in fact. That's a big character arc between movies. But it's also brilliant because we can't stop looking at him. Anthony Perkins' performance in this film is better than his performance in the original. It is so much more nuanced. There's so much more depth. He does so many things in this movie. Everything from playing for our sympathy to Riley suggesting might be something building up underneath that likable exterior, to some really great gallows humor moments that don't derail the movie like would happen in a Marvel film, whereas, all tension is instantly gone. No, here it actually ratchets up the tension because even the humor seems like it's a weapon. It's being used to make us question what we're watching. Are we watching the story of a righteous man being prosecuted? Are we watching a ghost movie, which this film is designed like? Or are we watching a film about a man who's going to slowly lose his mind and descend back to where he was? Taking inspiration from a lot of the pulp novels of the 40s and 50s was a great move here, because the kind of shifting narrative that occurs, especially as we go to the final act, the plot to drive someone insane, which of course is at the hands of our old heroine, Lila Crane. That's a brilliant way to absolutely just take our expectations and subvert them in a really grounded, realistic way. Yeah, if someone killed my sister, I would probably want them to spend the rest of their life behind bars, and I'd probably do whatever that took. It's believable. But still, it's dastardly. It's horrible. Norman Bates we see in Psycho 2 is not the Norman Bates of the original. I mean, right? But there's a little tickle in the back of your brain saying, but what if she's right? What if he does snap? What if this is just a pause? That they push her over the edge and they're responsible for what ultimately happens, which is a reset back to exactly where we were before the original Psycho began. It's not irony so much as it feels like just the only logical answer to this kind of tragedy. Tragedy begets tragedy. Hurt people hurt people. But along the way, the ones that get hurt the most, not with sharp, stabby, metal objects, but mentally are really treated the worst. That's Norman. Norman is put through hell in this movie. That he comes out in a place where he's kind of vindicated, but now back in the role of villain. Well, that's just brilliant. Psycho 2 also benefits from not having to do any real heavy lifting. The first film, set up all of its beats. Now it just has to go through and tell its own story that reflects those beats in an interesting way, and it does so brilliantly. There is no final denouncement scene where a psychiatrist talks to a sheriff about exactly what happened to get us to this point. It doesn't need that. Instead, the introduction of Norman's real mother, well, that's kind of the ultimate nod to Hitchcock cinema, right? I mean, some people might see it as unfair. The same people say that, Mrs. Voorhees popping up at the end of Friday the 13th is unfair because you can't really see it coming. But that's the point, isn't it? The same way you can't really see the shower scene coming in the original film on first view if you haven't been told about it. You're not ready for what you're getting. That's how this film sneaks up with you its final twist. Without that scene, there's plot holes galore. With that scene of Norman's real mother showing up, it is an incredibly tight narrative. It makes sense. It comes full circle. It's just beautiful. This is the best conceived sequel in film history. Now, my favorite film is a sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, and this, Psycho 2, is not anywhere near as good a film as Bride of Frankenstein. I'm going to put that out there right at the onset. But the difference there is that Bride of Frankenstein is in no way a conceptual answer to the first film. It's its own thing. It is a monstrous, rollicking, ironic, witty, perfect film. Psycho 2 isn't a perfect film, but it is the perfect bookend to the first film. It manages to convey a new story that relies on you knowing the original, but doesn't rely on repeating the original. And how brilliant is that? So often we hear about subverting expectations in a negative light today. That Star Wars, that second new Star Wars film is the one people always point to as doing it very poorly. This is the opposite of that. This is where it's worthy to take someone's expectations and twist them, not in a way that degrades the characters or the drama, but enhances it. And in this case, enhances not only the film you're watching, but also the film that you know and love that you didn't think this could approach the greatness of. That's a trick I don't know if we'll ever see done in cinema again. I don't know if we'll ever see another companion film that increases the value of the original the way that Psycho 2 does to Psycho. If you've not seen Psycho 2, well, you need to see Psycho 2, right? It's available everywhere. It's never been obscure. It's never been hard to find. It's in English. It is in color. It's everything you hear that people need it to be to find it relatable. Like Norman Bates, this movie is infinitely relatable and infinitely rewatchable. I guess people would call it a slow burn today, which is kind of one of those terms that's starting to get more and more annoying every time I hear it, because I don't know exactly what people want. Do they want just our horror movies to be video games today? Do they want everything to be as fast as one of those Resident Evil sequels? Because I don't want that. I want to live and stew in those dark moments. I want to feel things deeply and have the time to feel things deeply. Psycho 2 does all that. Along the way, sure, it borrows beats from other films. I mean, it's even borrowing from The Shining in some ways. House by the Cemetery gets a nod in this film, pretty blatantly. But you know what? None of that stops the story that it's telling in its steps. You know, it continues to roll on and get better and better. It's one of those rare films that the second act is better than the first, and the third act is better than the second. And you know what? The first act was pretty goddamn good to begin with. If you haven't seen it, see the film. If you haven't watched it in a while, watch it again. If you've never watched them back to back, Psycho and Psycho 2, do that. And for my brothers and sisters out there that love 3 and 4 and the remake, there's no one who likes a remake, or the television series, or that NBC pilot episode for Bates Motel that aired in the late 80s that went nowhere and has Bud Cort in it. It's not very good. If you love all that stuff, that's great. But Psycho and Psycho 2 are something very special and need to be put in a different category. They are, in many ways, the foundation of the modern psychotronic horror film. See you later.